Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding TV, a podcast about television. I am David Chen.
I'm Roxana Hadadi.
Welcome to the podcast. On today's episode of Decoding TV, we're going to be covering The White Lotus, Season 5, Episode 6.
Season 2, Episode 6.
Sorry, I'm getting this confused with The Crown.
It's all right.
Season 2, Episode 6, Abductions is the name of the episode. You can find more episodes of this podcast at podcast.decodingtv.com. Email us at decodingtv@gmail.com and find us on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram at decodingtv. And if you want to support this podcast, if you're like, hey, I enjoy that show, I want that podcast to keep going with interesting, fascinating, smart, intelligent, insightful co-hosts throughout the year, become a paid member at decodingtv.com, why don't you? And get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, and exclusive bonuses. Before we get to our conversation about Season 2, Episode 6, Roxana, I look at the numbers for this podcast mostly every week. I check the stats. I see, because we're covering different shows in Decoding TV. We're covering, until recently, we've been covering Andor. We've been covering The Crown. We're covering White Lotus. And, the numbers are all like roughly the same. Like downloads, there's some shows are more popular than others, some episodes more popular than others, but like roughly they all get about the same number of downloads.
Okay.
So it can be really difficult to know whether anyone's listening.
Sure.
Whether there's anyone out there enjoying the podcast, having a good time, hearing our insights and banter. It's just you throw something out into the universe. And it's like, if you don't get any emails back, it's like, at decodingtv@gmail.com, maybe like no one listens, or maybe only like my family and friends listen, if that.
Right.
And that's it. That's what it's like to be a podcaster.
Yeah.
It's just what you sign up for, You don't know who's listening to the podcast. Well, here's a way to find out. Is if you make an oversight, or if you fail to mention something or make a mistake.
Sure.
That's a really good way to find out if people are listening to you, because if you have made an oversight or forget to mention something, and let's say literally over 150 people email you, then it does seem to indicate, hey, people are listening and they care. And they care.
People care a lot about Daphne's potential child with her trainer, like so much.
We got literally over 150 emails. I counted over 150 emails this week at decodingtv@gmail.com from people being like, I can't believe you missed the fact that when Daphne handed her phone to Harper last week and said, here's my trainer, blonde hair, blue eyes, he's really good looking. And it was in fact a photo of Daphne's children that Daphne was trying to tell Harper that her children were with the trainer, right? That is what...
At least one child, I guess. Maybe one of the children.
Yeah, at least one of the children. The blonde yes. Yeah. Right? And people further said that, hey, the fact that you then see Cam in like the next scene and he's clearly has brown hair and, brown eyes, obviously the show and Daphne saying Daphne had a kid with the trainer. Now, I do want to say, I have a bunch of feelings about the vehemence with which people wrote this in.
Well, here's what I will say, which is, as we discussed, the screener episode did not have a picture. And from my own personal life experience, I'm Iranian American. Both my parents are Iranian American. When my brother was born, he was blonde, very blonde, so blonde that in the 80s, people thought that my parents had kidnapped him and would go up to them in public places, like with like security, like at the mall, to be like, is this your child?
Oh shit.
So yeah. So I'm very I guess when I saw a blonde child, I just thought like, oh, okay.
Yeah, okay. I mean I have a few thoughts, right? Like there's several reasons. Like number one, I think it is very reasonable for people who listen to a White Lotus recap podcast to not be happy when the hosts of that show miss something that they think is glaringly obvious. Like that,
Sure.
that makes sense because you're like, you listen to in my opinion, you listen to a recap podcast for insight and for stuff that you wouldn't have picked up on your own. And so if the hosts fail to do that, I understand why people are upset. People literally writing in saying they were screaming at their phones out loud when we didn't include this. Now, I will say in my defense, there's a couple of reasons why this happened, right? The most obvious ones are Roxana said last week that she got a screener that did not have the image in the during the episode, right? So obviously she wouldn't have known what was going on there.
I just thought it was going to be the trainer. Little did I know.
And Roxana is the person who is basically my safety net, who prevents me from making humiliating mistakes.
Oh, so I made the humiliating.
Yeah. So when Roxana can't prevent me from making a mistake, like that's when things really go off the rails. The second thing is I have a very poor grasp of Mendelian genetics. And it's something I've been working on. I'm open about it. But seriously, though, I mean, here is my bar for a theory like this, and I think it is a theory. I think it's very likely correct. But obviously Daphne does not confirm it or anything like that,
right?
Nor do we know from the show. I think it's very likely correct, but my bar when people bring up a theory like this is, does it make the show more rich and interesting? And in my opinion, it does.
Oh yeah,
it does in this case. In particular, if you think about how Daphne was talking about almost losing one of her children earlier on in the season,
right?
The idea is that yes, Cam is a cad and cheats on her, but the fact that she had this child with this other person and Cam and her are raising them, these kids together, is like the hugest of power moves from Daphne.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so it provides that scene from earlier on the season a much more depth and richness, in my opinion. It also makes Daphne out to be much more conniving, dark, and manipulative than that we might have otherwise guessed. So I do think it makes the episode or the season more rich. That said, it's also possible that it's not her, it's not her child with the trainer. Like I don't think it's 100% certain. We did get one lone email from someone named Rhett who wrote in, quote, "I've seen a ton of White Lotus theories that feel like wild stretches. For one, some users think Daphne mentioned her blonde trainer and then showed a picture of her kids because he is the father of one of her children. Why? Because one of her kids has blonde hair compared to the darker features of the other one, which more closely resemble Cam. But what they fail to think about is Daphne also has blonde hair.
Yeah, Daphne is blonde.
No way such a reveal could be done in that subtle of a way." End quote.
I personally think either read is good character development for Daphne. I think most people are probably intuiting correctly that Daphne is, as you said, a little bit more conniving, more clever, more mind gamesy than we probably initially thought. Certainly more so than Harper initially thought. So I think the read of, hey, maybe this is the trainer's kid, is totally valid. I could also just see Daphne mentioning the trainer thing, as some other people said in email, to encourage Harper to like do her own thing to find her own happiness. So I think either read adds more to Daphne, but yeah, probably should have seen what the photo was. I just assumed it was going to be like a hot trainer, and I was like, okay, well there we go.
I mean, Aubrey Plaza's character did say like, "Hey, this is just a photo of your kids."
Yeah.
I mean, it is a kind of weird way to introduce it, but yes, that I do think that the theory is likely correct, and this does make Cam and Daphne's relationship more interesting and textured and disturbing. I would argue than otherwise, but. As you yourself said, Roxana, just because they're blonde and blue-eyed doesn't mean that and Megan Fahey's performance as Daphne is ambiguous enough that I think it could be read either way. So it's an interesting scene, and clearly people have lots of strong opinions on it, but it shows that you're listening to the podcast and you give a shit
Yeah.
about the podcast. And I really appreciate that. So thank you to everyone who wrote in at
Yes.
decodingtv@gmail.com. Speaking of people who wrote into decodingtv@gmail.com, I think we put the question out last episode: is David Chen sex positive or sex negative?
Asked with 100% sincerity. There was no sarcasm to the question at all. We really wanted to know, should we ostracize Dave forever?
And I think what was at stake was like, I thought that Dom should be telling Albie that he had sex with Lucia.
Yes.
And you were like, you, Roxana, if I recall correctly, were like, I don't think there's necessarily an obligation there.
Yeah.
We got lots of emails about this, and I would say the majority of them sided with me.
Yeah, I think there was like a 70-30 split.
Yeah, I think that's
a
about right.
lot of people sided with you on the argument of she is a sex worker, and so he should have told her from that front. There was also the angle that if Dom is really trying to be more honest with his son, then that should have happened, and he should have sort of like accepted the consequences of that. And then there was also just the third, a general sort of like ick factor reaction, right? Where people were like, if I knew of a relative, a child, a father, a cousin, a sibling, whatever, who was sleeping with one person and then there was someone else in the same family who was going to do that, that information should be shared. So yeah, I would say that there was a heavily we can continue to let Dave operate in our society viewpoint, which is great.
Wow.
But there were also
such a generous
some people,
interpretation.
yeah, there were also some people who sided with me. So thank you so much, people. It's the people who are wrong, I think, is really where we come down on. So yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you for people defending me on that front. Really appreciate that. Finally, I wanted to just mention that several people via email predicted the twist that was revealed in this week's episode of the podcast, which is that the cowboy that Quentin talked about meeting in last episode was Greg. Now, I thought this is actually a ridiculous fan theory. Like, I was like, there's no way, because they're so... Quentin and Greg feel like such different people. The idea that they would meet in Wyoming in like a similar plot to Brokeback Mountain feels like a little bit too out there. But here's an email from LaTanya, who writes into decodingtv@gmail.com. What if Greg is Quentin's Wyoming heterosexual lover? Work with me here. I think Greg was speaking to Quentin on the phone on the balcony before he left. We know that Tanya and Greg had signed a prenup. That was made very clear during their argument. The only way for Greg to get Tanya's money is her death. What if Greg and Quentin are working together to get Tanya's money? Greg left Tanya to prepare for the murder, and he's hiding out at the villa. I also think that is why he really wanted her to get rid of Portia. There was a very sinister discussion between Tanya and Quentin about Beauty. Quentin says he would die for Beauty. Then he asks Tanya, wouldn't you? He has this villa he cannot afford. He's got this entire posse of gays who are probably part of the plot, and I doubt Jack is Quentin's nephew. Jack is playing his part to distract Portia so their murder plot can move forward without any interruptions from her, end quote.
A lot of that turned out to be true.
I mean, it's probably going to be true. Like, we don't know exactly what the end game is, but it seems very likely at this point. And I should point out, LaTanya wrote that email before this week's episode of the show. So
we had a few people who wrote in and thought that. And I really was just like, is Quentin reciting the plot of Brokeback Mountain because he knows Tanya won't get it? But right. we can sort of talk about our reactions to that twist. But yes, I'm very impressed by the people who figured that out.
Basically, our listeners are very impressive, I think, is kind of the big takeaway from this. If you're a listener, you're writing into us at decodingtv@gmail.com or a commenter at decodingtv.com, a paid member, then you're pretty impressive. And thank you for listening. We appreciate it. Okay. Really glad to get that off my chest.
All of it? Every single aspect of it? The 150 emails?
Yeah.
Sex positivity?
I just think it's,
Wyoming.
I'm extremely grateful we have such an engaged audience, but it is just like, it's just a lot to receive, like dozens and dozens of emails of people saying, I was literally screaming at my phone listening to your podcast because of your ignorance. Getting one or three of those emails is like, okay, yeah, whatever. But like getting like literally over 100 is like, just a lot to go through. And hopefully people will listen to this segment and feel that they don't need to send in an email about that specific topic anymore. But feel free to...
Unless we have something in the finale episode that
Mhm.
is Daphne further addressing the parentage of her
Mm.
children.
Mhm. Mhm. All right, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Season 2, episode 6, Abductions. Ethan and Harper. Let's start with them as usual.
Mhm.
Ethan's awake in his chair. Harper is sleeping on the bed, and Ethan is not happy because
No.
Harper is acting as Ethan describes, like she doesn't believe him. She thinks that
Right.
he still cheated on her, and then they have what I think is a very heartbreaking, mature, reasonable conversation about their lack of attraction for each other.
Yeah.
And she has this great line about how we're too young to be this old, end quote,
Mhm.
right? Like there is no electricity in their relationship anymore, and she's acknowledging that, and he is still kind of like clinging on to this relationship, but he doesn't really dispute anything she says, as far as I can tell. What did you think of this conversation between the two of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're having two different conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can see both sides. I can see Harper's perspective where it's like we can't seem to sync our schedules. We can't seem to find physical time to spend together, which perhaps addresses something you and I have talked about before, which is like, why aren't they doing anything on their own? Right? Like, why is neither of them saying, like, hey, let's just do something without Cam and Daphne? Maybe because there isn't anything that is a shared interest anymore. So I totally see Harper's perspective. But then from Ethan's, I did feel bad when he was like, I'm telling you the truth and you don't trust me, and that's hurting my feelings. There was something very sort of naive about that reaction, but it did make me think, like, oh, Ethan, if only you had told her the truth from the beginning
Yeah, if
instead
only
of
you had.
abiding by bro code
Yeah,
for
if only you had
whatever.
ignored bro code,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be in this mess.
Yeah.
Um,
So
but
yeah, I think it's a they love each other but are probably not in love with each other
mhm,
anymore
yeah.
situation, but it just gets messier as the day progresses.
Well, that's what's so weird to me. I mean, I guess we usually start by talking about overall thoughts on the episode, Roxana.
Mhm.
So sorry, I skipped ahead.
No, no,
Like,
no. We're
what were
doing
your
it.
overall thoughts on this one? Because I think you're mixed on this one, right?
I'm mixed. I mean, again, I have been increasingly coming around sort of on the like dual couple storylines because some of it is like a little bit predictable. Like I think we knew from the beginning that probably something was going to happen between Harper and Cam, or somebody was going to believe something happened between Harper and Cam. We don't exactly know. So some of that is predictable, but some of the dialogue here, like you said, I found very smartly written and compellingly acted. But then some of the other stuff, I don't really love the Greg Quentin connection. I think it feels a little bit too neat for the story. And Lucia and Mia continue to be a question mark for me. So, an episode of Up and Downs, some stuff I really, really liked, and some stuff that I'm just curious how this wraps next episode.
I continue to enjoy the show because I do feel like it does a great job of capturing character dynamics. For the most
Mm-hmm.
part, these all feel like real people in the real world that could
Mm-hmm.
exist. That some of whom I've actually met before.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, some of the dialogue is great, some of the acting is great. The Ethan stuff is a little weird to me this episode because
Mm-hmm.
this opening sequence was like really awesome. I thought this was like, oh, this is how like a relationship falls apart. But
Yeah.
then the rest of this episode is about his like jealousy
Right.
and it's just like, where did this come from? I guess we're just leaning on the idea that like any guy would be jealous, and it does seed in that like Cam is kind of alpha male and has
Yeah.
probably stirred the pot with Ethan before when it comes to like romantic interests, but
Mm-hmm.
we haven't really seen Ethan act like this the rest of the season,
Mm-hmm.
like super possessive like this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that to me is just a little odd to me, Ethan. The fact that most of this episode concentrates on Ethan's jealousy,
Did you
when in fact like this part about like this relationship slowly unraveling is the most interesting part. It's like rather than this plot of like, oh, it did Harper and Cam do something together? Like that's kind of it creates this mystery of like, did they do
mm-hmm.
something together? Like that's what the audience is focused on. The thing I'm focused on is like, put that aside. Like, what is going to happen to their relationship regardless of that.
Right.
That is more
Right.
interesting to me than like this mystery box of the Cam and Harper stuff. So anyway, what
Did
we're gonna ask,
you?
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I definitely agree with you that I feel like this was sort of a little bit of a gender essentialist read,
Yeah,
which we
yeah.
have avoided for Ethan so far. I guess my question is, did you think that he reached his breaking point and what we're seeing now is post that? Or did you feel like that character turn was not well established enough?
It's like, to believe that Ethan would behave the way he does in this episode,
Mm-hmm.
you'd have to think that he was extremely protective of his relationship with Harper, and or is like possessive, and or is insecure. Like one or more of those three things, I would
Mm-hmm.
say. And I just don't know that the show's done a great job of establishing those things.
Yeah, because we've
Other
seen
than that, he's like a dude, what I mean? And like
right.
any dude would be jealous if a other dude was sleeping with his wife, And I'm like, okay, like I thought the show was smarter than that, though. Like, but
And that's sort of where it like falls down a little bit for me. I think we have seen, I don't remember if it was the last episode or the one before where Harper was talking about, yes, she'd had a threesome. There were elements of
yeah,
her like past sexual history that I don't think Ethan knew. And I think we saw his surprise at those revelations a little bit. And I think the show has tried to establish that both couples have been lying to each other this whole time, and we're watching like how the opposite partner reacts to those
mm-hmm,
lies, I
mm-hmm,
guess.
yeah,
But I agree with you that Ethan, having been a little bit in the background while Harper was the dominant force in their relationship, the intensity of his reaction, I did buy it because I think we are meant to see Ethan as being very, at this point, in his own head
mm-hmm,
and sort of like obsessed with what could be happening when he's not around. But I think we established Harper a little bit better. So her turn was a little bit more believable. But Ethan's just seems maybe a little bit hasty in comparison. Or
yeah,
maybe, and I hate to go back to this, but maybe this is another spin on the nice guy.
uh-huh,
But truly, no, I truly
mm-hmm,
like, I'm not saying that to like stir something up. I'm being honest. Like, I think the scene where Ethan is like, "No, I'm not gaslighting you," the intensity with which I think he wants to like smooth over things with Harper. I wonder if this is another commentary on like how people view themselves versus how they actually act. So I don't mean like
right,
just the nice guy, quote unquote. But if the point is sort of like unpeeling
yeah, yeah.
the way that you think someone else views you versus how you actually view yourself, maybe that's the angle that we're supposed to apply to Ethan here.
That makes sense. I agree with you there. Hashtag justice for Albie.
Sure.
But yeah, that's an interesting idea. That like, yeah, on the outside, he's like a cool, understanding dude. But then when you like, oh, his wife might be cheating on him, that's like when the real Ethan comes out. Like that's
But then
yeah,
again,
that's
it goes back to your gender essentialist argument, which is, are we really saying that every guy would act like this? I don't know.
I. I think let me put it a different way. Is that like we've seen this story like thousands of times.
Sure.
Like this story of like, oh, a guy is jealous of his wife that might be cheating on him. Like we've seen that thousands of times. It's like hundreds of years for the last hundreds of years we've seen it.
Hmm.
And what is less common is like, hey, this is the slow decline of this relationship where these people are like lying to each other, and like how might they maturely deal with that?
Hmm.
That's way more interesting to me than
You
like,
wanted like the marriage story version of this.
yes,
Yeah.
totally. I think that's way more interesting than like, oh, is he cheating on, it's like I just don't care as much about it. And the Harper characterization, I just don't even know what's going on there, right? Like,
I
we're
agree.
skipping ahead but last episode I think Cam like touches her leg, or a couple episodes ago he touches her leg, and it's like, wait, did Cam and Harper have something at some where they like
Right.
did they hook up at some point, or is Harper just more open minded than like we know about? The problem is for me, I think Aubrey Plaza is doing an awesome job, but like from a character perspective, we've spent most of the show with her being pretty uptight. right? Like with her being really specific about what she is looking for in terms of a vacation or a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then for her to just now be like, oh, I'm open to other things. I could read it as maybe she's getting revenge on Ethan a little bit for making her feel uncomfortable, right? Like that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But is that it? I don't even know. Anyway,
But again, it's like I don't love that, because
yeah,
then are you just saying that like any woman who experiences jealousy then cheats on her partner to make him feel bad? I
right.
don't know. We might be thinking about these things too broadly, if only because I think Ethan and Harper lack a little bit of the manipulative specificity that Cam and Daphne have. Like
Mm-hmm.
Cam and Daphne's
Yeah.
interactions are full of so many lies that they're each telling each other,
Yeah.
but each of them knows that they're lying, right? It's a really interesting use
Yeah.
of like an open secret type of thing with their relationship where each of them knows that the other is not telling the whole truth.
Mm-hmm.
With Ethan and Harper, I think we're sort of hitting up against, I think we're supposed to take these characters a little bit more sincerely and more
Yes.
earnestly than we take Cam and get Daphne. So now that we're injecting some like obfuscation or
Mm-hmm.
confusion in their storyline, it just becomes unclear. Like I really don't know
Yeah.
what we're supposed to think if Harper and Cam did do something, or if we're just supposed to be focused on Ethan's reaction to that. I'm not sure the story tells us one way or the other.
Beautifully said, and I think it's much more clear with the Cam and Daphne stuff, right? So
Yeah.
there's a scene with Cam and Daphne in their suite, and Daphne brings up Harper's concern and says like, "Hey, Harper's pretty convinced that you guys did something bad while we were in Noto. What'd you do this time? You know,
Wink, wink,
wink,
nudge,
wink. How
nudge.
hard did you party? And, oh, we just
Right.
partied, and um, and I think you're right that on some level they both know that each other is lying or like
Mm-hmm.
is concealing the truth, and that's fascinating, and I think that's like a very consistent. The season has been like consistent about them throughout the season, like overall, right? I don't feel
Right.
like it's like where is this coming from? I think gender essentialism is a great way of putting it, because I think what we're saying is there anything about how Ethan and Harper are acting that is explained by what we see on screen versus just this is a dude and this is a woman, right?
That
Like
is
that's
unique to
yeah,
them
that
as
is unique to
characters.
them, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I agree, it's a little bit of a challenge. So anyway, a few other things happen in this episode of Ethan, Daphne, Harper, Cam. Ethan is coming back from his run, and he's confronted by Lucia and Mia, who still have not been paid by Cam.
Mm-hmm.
And then Harper sees that, and that further upsets her, and he can't explain in the moment because conveniently Cam and Daphne show up right at that point.
Right
Again,
there.
at,
Yeah.
at this point, I'm just like, why would you hang out with I
I
don't know. I've been on trips with people, and it's like, at this point in the trip, I'd be like, hey, we're not hanging out anymore. We're gonna go
yeah.
do our own thing. We had fun, but like we're gonna do our own thing. And it's just like the idea that they would continue hanging out with each other just like completely makes no sense to me. But whatever. I'm
The
more antisocial than these people. So
Well, the only
anyway.
thing that I think is sort of interesting is that it seems like Daphne and Harper have actually developed a real friendship.
Mm,
And so I think that's sort of interesting. It doesn't explain why the couples would still necessarily be hanging out with each
yeah.
other, why one of them wouldn't take a day trip. But I thought that there was something about the dynamic between the two women this episode which felt more comfortable and familiar. And I liked that. I thought that was a
Yeah.
nice sort of addition.
Well, you know what else I think is really well done? I mean, as we've been discussing, right? They go down to the beach, and Daphne goes away for like a massage, and then
Hmm.
Ethan goes swimming. Cam and Harper go back to the room, and then Ethan thinks that something weird has happened, or they get drinks and they're really really friendly, like, and then they vanish and they go to the room, and then Ethan comes back, and then he thinks something's happened. And I thought the setup was all just really smart. Like,
Hmm.
there's just enough there that you'd understand why Ethan would be
Would
upset,
think something
but there's
happened.
enough like it could all just be innocent, like plausible deniability,
Right.
and that part is really well done. Like
Hmm.
it's just like, ooh, like I don't even know what exactly happened, and I think
Yeah.
it's supposed to be ambiguous at this point.
Yeah.
So there's just it's just like it's fun. It's a fun setup.
Hmm.
Just like little touches, like the door being unlocked and the little deadbolt thingy being in the way. All that stuff is just like, these are nice little touches from a mystery perspective.
It made me think, have we seen Cam read? Because I love that his Cam was going back to get a book. That really made me laugh.
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
thought about like freezing to see if we could see what the book was.
Mm-hmm,
But I think
mm-hmm.
it's never quite in focus enough. But that's another thing where I'm like, would Cam be going back to get like a novel to read on the beach? I don't know.
He doesn't seem like the reading type.
Yeah, I
I
don't
also
know.
think this reinforces the idea that Cam like has no money. You know, I brought up that
Yes,
theory a couple weeks ago or last week, but like
I agree.
I think he's probably broke and he's trying like Ethan's paying for this trip or something like that, and
Or
he
maybe
needs
Ethan does not yet know that he's going to be asked to pay for this trip. I
right.
could see
Yeah,
Cam
totally.
saying like, "Hey, because you didn't inside trade with me, why don't you, with your
Yeah, you're
newfound
gonna cover
wealth,
this
cover
one
the trip?"
as an
Yeah,
act of good faith. You'll cover the, you know, like,
yeah.
um, but yeah, my guess is that Cam is either too busy to get his money for his sex worker, or
Mhm.
uh, he doesn't have any money.
Or
It's one.
third option, he's just an asshole who was never going to pay them anyway.
Yes, yes, any
You
of
know,
those
that's
things.
also a possibility because sometimes I think that we're looking for deeper motivations for Cam's actions because we're trying to figure out who died potentially. But I think a lot about Shane in season 1, there sometimes weren't motivations past he was just awful, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
So it's a
maybe.
possibility.
Ethan confronts Cam about all the stuff that's happened. Like, why are you flirting with my wife? I know you were
Right.
naked with her. Like all this stuff, and Cam is like, "You're out of your mind."
Denies
And
it, just
yeah,
denies it. Yeah.
just comfort. And then we get our first, I think, like visual hallucination sequence in the White Lotus, if I am correct about
I
one, if not the first, and one of the first, where like
well,
he's seeing a scene sequence play out that he doesn't know if it actually is real, right?
yeah, I think we had a little, maybe a touch of this earlier in the season when Tanya and Greg are having sex and she gets frightened by the Moors heads.
Yeah, yeah,
So I don't think she fantasizes, but there is sort of a surreal quality
correct. Yeah.
to that. And then in this, it's interesting because the audio design, we hear the noises of the scene first before we see that it's Ethan, and then before we pivot over and see what he's imagining. So again, like you said, interestingly and well done, very well shot. And I guess it does give us a perspective about what Ethan is worrying about, feeling, seeing, quote unquote. I just, again, I'm like, I
It
don't
just it
know.
just comes a little bit out of nowhere for me. Like it would be. I know there's the conversation that Cam and Ethan had at the vineyard of like, oh, different dating pools, and like I was
Right.
never interested in people you were interested in, and like you date the people I'm interested in because you want to like feel as powerful as me. Like it is like kind of set up, but I wish we got a little bit more setup of like, why does it matter to Ethan if Harper is cheating on him? Like why? How
Okay.
important is their relationship to Ethan? Do you
At
know what I
this
mean?
point,
At this point, right?
I think we
Like,
sort of get that when he says that he wants to work on it earlier in
yeah,
the episode. But I agree
yeah.
with you. It's a couple
But,
lines
but
of
like throughout
dialogue.
I wish we'd gotten it throughout the season of like,
Yeah.
hey, he knows that he and Harper are on the rocks, and like this
Mhm.
trip, they really need this trip to like rekindle
Reset the
things. Yeah,
relationship.
exactly.
Right.
And then it's like, oh, it's going south. Like that would make way more sense to me. Instead, this whole plot line feels like it comes out of nowhere for me.
See, that's
Um,
exactly how I felt about the Harper plotline. Like, I thought Aubrey Plaza acted it well,
yeah.
but I couldn't understand why she would seemingly indulge Cam in like sexual conversations or conversations about her own history. Again, it's like I understand that Ethan had been like, hey, try to have fun, like
Hmm.
loosen up a little bit. But for her to take that turn into whatever she's doing with Cam felt a little bit outside of the realm for me. The only thing I'll say is I wonder if what's happening here is sort of like a shifting perspective, Rashomon type thing, where Ethan is seeing it a certain way. And so we're seeing it the way Ethan is seeing it. And maybe
Hmm.
Harper isn't really flirting as much with Cam. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of other ways maybe where this storytelling could feel a little bit more cohesive.
In terms of your question of like, what is Harper doing? I have a few theories, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, which I've already mentioned a little bit. Like
The
maybe
jealousy.
Harper, yeah, maybe Harper and Cam have already gotten together before in the past, and we don't know
Mm.
about it. Maybe Harper's trying to make Ethan jealous. Maybe Harper is using this as an opportunity to explore what an extramarital engagement might feel and look like.
And she does have that line where she's like, basically like the physical aspect of our
Right.
relationship. Like I need more
Yeah, she needs more.
physicality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. But from this guy who you clearly hate,
That's the thing.
you couldn't find any other just like
That's the
handsome
thing.
guy to flirt with at the
It just
resort.
all doesn't like quite add up for me. Like it'd be one thing if like she found him appealing in some way. I don't know. Maybe it's like, oh, who wouldn't find Cam appealing? And like that's kind of what we're supposed to think. But
I don't
anyway,
know.
anyway.
Sorry to Theo James. It's nothing against Theo James. It's
Mhm.
just it's an interesting turn to be like, I hate everything about you and what you stand for and who you are as a person, to I'm gonna shrug my shirt off so you can see me better in my bikini. Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
entirely love it.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. Well, one thing I can say about that scene with Ethan in this episode of The White Lotus is when he gets those horrifying visions in his head,
Mhm.
he probably feels electrified by them.
Mm, probably, yeah.
And I mention that because this episode of Decoding TV is brought to you by Nissan, except they're electrifying you in a good way. You see, as a pioneer in the electric vehicle space, Nissan's always looking for ways to deliver meaningful technologies to EV owners. After all, Nissan has been making EVs since 1947, and their EVs have now traveled 8 billion miles by Nissan Leaf owners since 2010. 8 billion miles. That's
That's
the equivalent
crazy.
of driving to Pluto and back.
Oh, wow.
Think that's electrifying? One of their EVs trekked all the way to the North Pole, and Nissan even tests their EV technology on the Formula E racetrack. But Nissan knows you don't just get an EV for the E, you get an EV because it makes you feel electric, because
Hmm.
it sparks your imagination, it ignites something within you, it pins you to your seat, it takes your breath away. At least that's what Nissan thinks about when designing their EVs like the Nissan Ariya and the Nissan Leaf. It's about creating a thrilling design that electrifies customers. I love Nissan's focus on creating a thrilling drive and an electrifying life. In today's world, it's so important to look around you, pay attention, and look for all the tiny ways that life can electrify you. Like, for instance, in the case of the White Lotus, I mean, so many things are electrifying in the White Lotus. Flirting with danger,
Yeah.
flirting with people outside of who you'd normally flirt with. Anyway, a huge thanks to Nissan for sponsoring this episode of Decoding TV. Nissan EVs that electrify. All right, let's get to the rest of the episode. Albie and Lucia, Dom and Bert. So, uh, you know what my big complaint with the White Lotus has been so far,
Mhm.
Roxana? Not enough graphic sex scenes with Albie. You know, um,
You have not had enough. You need
I,
more.
I've needed more, and this episode answered the call. So
Yeah.
thank God we
I think
got to
this was
see.
actually the least graphic, right?
Yeah, I think there was no like
There's no
explicit
yeah,
nudity. Yeah.
I think maybe we see faces and potentially torsos, but we did get the establishing shot of like, don't worry, Albie and Lucia are still doing this. No discussion of payment at this point
Mm-hmm.
past
Mm-hmm.
that interaction. So I wonder again, like, are they for now just hanging out? Seems like it.
I mean, I think that Albie is Lucia's mark. You
Yeah.
know, I
You're
think
thinking there's a long con happening.
there is a long con happening now.
Yeah.
I want to thank Anna Marie from Brooklyn for writing into decodingtv@gmail.com, and she sent in a translation of the conversation that happened between the man that grabbed Lucia, who's named Alessio,
Mhm.
while they were out with Albie.
Mhm.
Lucia says, "What's up?" And Alessio says, "Are you having fun?" And Lucia says, "Yes, I'm having fun." And Alessio says, "Why didn't you respond to my messages?" And Lucia says, "Because we're going for a walk." He then says something inaudible or incomprehensible while he grabs her, almost like he's just mimicking or mocking what she just said. And then she pulls away and says, "What the fuck are you doing?" And then walks off. That's the conversation.
Okay, so very opaque.
Yeah, and somewhat innocuous, arguably, you know?
Arguably, could
Yeah.
be an ex-boyfriend,
Yeah.
could be a just a guy, could be
Yeah.
another client. I mean, I don't know.
The
We don't know.
implication from the show is pimp, right? I
Yes,
think,
she
but
has said
yeah.
Alessio is her pimp, and that is part of the like story that she is sort of telling Albie about being I don't think she's ever said necessarily abused, but she does say, she has a story, and we'll get to it later on this episode, where she says, like, he doesn't want to let me go. He won't let me go.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's also possible that Lucia is conspiring with Alessio to extract as much money out of Albie
Oh
as
yeah, no,
possible.
I think right now, I think the show is sort of tipping toward a long con sort of storyline.
I mean, here's kind of my broader issue with this episode is I just don't feel like we're gonna have a satisfying resolution on all these plot lines by next episode. Like, it still feels like we're like 3 to 4 episodes from the end, and next week is the finale of this season. You know?
I kind of feel like there are some jumps happening here between like character development and narrative that I wish we had gotten like another episode, maybe between 5 and 6, to flesh out a little bit more.
Well, anyway, this episode they decide to go to Bert's mother's hometown,
which was the entire point of the trip for the Degrassos.
Right. Yeah,
it was the entire point. They're finally doing it now, like 6 days into their week-long trip.
Yes. Bert and Dom are hopeful. Bert, in particular, is looking forward to the opportunity of a real homecoming, and
Right.
Albie finds a translator who is Lucia. He introduces Lucia as a translator. Lucia does not make it obvious that she's met Dom, but Dom is being awkward, and Bert calls him on it. This is fun. This is fun stuff. This is
really good writing for those characters.
Yeah, awkward, painful, cringy stuff. This is kind of what I enjoy the White Lotus for.
And you get, again, we get more of a sense that Bert is very good at this, right? He knows how to divert a conversation. He knows how to play the game sort of that Cam and Daphne are playing with each other. Bert basically tells Dom, like, get it together, otherwise you're going to give the game away. If you really don't want Albie to know, then you need to chill.
Yeah.
And yeah, then they leave for the trip.
Yeah, so they learn there's still a Degrasso family in the town that they visit, but Lucia is unnerved by the appearance of a man she says is Alessio in an SUV that followed him there. There's a weird confrontation on the road. They pull over, and then Lucia goes home with Alessio, but the other guys are trying to stop her because they all think that something is really wrong.
Right.
But then Lucia shows up later at Albie's hotel room, and she seems unharmed. At that point, if
physically
I
unharmed, yeah.
I
really love that scene. We don't have to talk about it in depth, but again, I liked the Degrasso generations like uniting for something. Yes, it's uniting to defend a woman who might be conning them, but I liked sort of everyone's approach. Like, I like that Dom.
Yeah, they're all different in their own way, right?
Dom suddenly becomes a heavy. And he's like, we could take these guys, right?
Yeah.
Albie, of course, is like, well, it's more respectful if we let her do what she wants and we shouldn't escalate it, which is a sort of hilarious Albie response. And then Bert is just shocked. Like, my heart broke for Bert a little bit this episode because I think things keep happening that he doesn't understand and can't really figure out. Like, I think Bert potentially feels his own irrelevance this episode. And I think F. Murray Abraham did a really good job with that.
He's awesome. This, I'm not saying he's not a piece of shit as a character.
Sure.
But he was so off-putting in the first episode, like harassing everyone.
Yeah.
And then he's become like kind of, in some ways, a Greek chorus or audience surrogate character, like watching this madness unfold around him and providing funny commentary. So I've really enjoyed that character's presence for the rest of the season. But as you indicate, they get to the Degrasso family relative's house, and it's 3 women, maybe 2 or 3 generations. Bert's aunt, Bert's cousins. They only speak Italian. They do not understand or are not interested in engaging with what the men have to say, and eventually tell them to run off. What do we need men for? The woman asks. Bert asks to see their mother, and they laugh at the idea because she's a real hard case, commands them to leave, and immediately starts screaming at them.
Yeah.
She says things like, "You want the pretty money, shame on you. I curse you and your kind, fuck off." So yeah, and then that's probably the culmination of this whole trip.
Yeah.
So what do you think you want the pretty money means? My guess at what was being said was this idea of like, you left for to find a more prosperous life, and like that departure was seen as a betrayal by people from their hometown. But I don't know. I don't really have any idea.
I have no clue. I mean, I think that could be part of it. Like, why are you coming back? You left.
Yeah.
also I don't know if we know exactly why Bert's mom left. I don't know if there's an illusion here that like maybe Bert's mother had a falling out with these other women.
Mm-hmm.
But because the language barrier, I'm not sure that they really know who Bert is.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if we're just doing like a generalized reading, I think it's three women who seem pretty self-sufficient and are like, what are these men doing here? Get out.
Right. Right. And this idea, as you said, like Bert is feeling his irrelevance. Like he, in his worldview, it's the role of women to like welcome him back
And
to his
comfort
home
him.
and
Yeah.
comfort him, and that is clearly not what he receives this episode. So,
Right. Right.
and he explains that
Mhm.
at when they have dinner at the end of the episode.
Mhm.
So, although he does have a nice moment with Mia and talks
Mhm.
about how good she's at singing and performing, so there's
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
The final scene, Lucia shows up at Albie's room, and she talks about how like Alessio wants to control her and he won't let me go. And Albie says, "What would it take to let you go?" And she says, "Money." And
Yeah.
I think it's a con. I think she's going to try to extract some money from him, and like that's the whole game.
I also
Um,
could see Take Me to LA with You.
yeah,
Yeah.
possibly,
And there's
possibly. So
part of me I don't know. I don't love that for either. I don't love Lucia or Mia or I don't know anything about how they're being
I
presented.
I have to say, yeah, sure. Like Lucia, like this is a situation where we don't know what we're watching, right? So it's
Yeah.
like we're not going to know until the end of the season, like whether the Lucia characterization was consistent throughout.
Right.
Um, but I do think it is worth noting that in the first episode, she says she found Dom online, and she
Right.
seems like pretty in control
Right.
of her own destiny at that point.
Right.
So,
And
you know,
earlier, I praised this scene, and I still think I still actually agree with this when Bert says to Albie, like, all women are not victims, right?
yeah,
Like, you don't
yeah,
necessarily need to be saving her. This could be a choice she's making. I sort of, and I sort of agree that Lucia, as a little bit of a femme fatale character, could be conning Albie, probably is conning Albie. And
yeah,
there's part of me that, like, respects that
yeah,
characterization. Like women can be bad too. That's great.
yeah.
I just wish that there was more to Lucia or more to Mia so we understood this storytelling a little bit more.
Yeah, totally,
Especially
totally.
Mia, because I really do not get what is going on there.
Well, they're holding. Yeah, Mia is just like a manic pixie dream piano player at this point. But
Yeah.
I think Lucia, they're just holding their cards until the final episode. Like it
Hmm.
will be. My guess is it'll be revealed next episode, and then we'll be like, oh, that's what the show was trying to do all
Hmm.
along, and then we can more fully evaluate how
Right. We could
successful
like
it was.
rewatch and
Yeah,
see how the pieces fit together.
right,
Right.
right. But the whole like Alessio is my pimp and he's trying to control me feels like it clashes pretty harshly with the characterization of Mia that we got in the first episode or two,
Or
where
with
she seems
Lucia's
like
characterization.
the Lucia characterization, where
Hmm.
she seems like she's having a blast, and like
Hmm.
I remember watching those episodes; those do not seem like a woman living in fear to me.
Well,
But
yeah, and it's
maybe I'm yeah,
and it's hard because again, it's like you don't necessarily want to be the person who judges like how does this female character react to a perceived threat? Does she react like
yeah,
afraid enough for me, right? Like
right,
that's sort of a
true,
slippery slope. But I
true,
think both you and I thought that her turn toward guilt, I think 3 or 4 episodes in, and feeling like she wasn't gonna be forgiven, and there was sort of
hmm
like a Catholic guilt thing that happened, that felt like a distinct turn that we did not have a lot of context or background for.
yeah,
And then I think in that same episode, or maybe in the next episode, is when like this Alessio figure appeared, right?
right,
So it just seems like a lot of rapid transformations for this character that might not necessarily be linked together in a yet fulfilling way.
yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
And good call out. Like, yeah, maybe she was under the threat of
But we
Alessio
just
the whole
don't know.
time, and like, different women would handle it in different ways. So yeah, I
Right.
don't mean to imply that like if you're being pimped out by someone, you must behave a certain way. Good,
Yeah.
it's a good call out.
Right. No, I
But
think what we're both looking for is for Lucia and Mia to have a scene where they're together long enough for either one of them to explain what they're doing to the other.
Right.
But to
Yeah.
sort of introduce these characters as best friends who we now have seen be separate for a couple of
Yeah.
episodes, it doesn't help explain their motivations, really.
Let's talk about Tanya and Quentin.
Let's do it.
Tanya and Portia talk, with Tanya warning Portia about Jack.
Mm-hmm.
I actually really like that scene. Tanya's behavior this whole episode is very like muted. You know, she's very like not happy-go-lucky. You know, randomly doing things. I mean, she's going along with what's going on, but she feels very like, you know, she's muted because she's seen something that's upset her, which is that either Quentin's having sex with his nephew or Quentin's lying about who his nephew is. Like one of those two things is
one
true.
or the other. There's like an element here that is not good. But again,
I love when she's like, I just have a strong hunch
yeah,
that that's the case, and it's a fun moment.
But again, like, wouldn't you leave? I'm just like, wouldn't you go? Wouldn't you be like, okay, this is weird. My hosts are clearly lying about themselves or whatever. I should leave.
Quentin is saying very dark, ominous things about wouldn't you die for beauty? Like it's just, but you know, the social pressure, I guess.
And we do know that Tanya is sort of flighty in her own way. But yes, I mean, honestly, Tanya is absent for most of this episode. There's the conversation with Portia in the morning, and then a whole day seems to pass where we don't know what Tanya is doing. And then we just see her getting ready for the party, right? And then the party happens that night.
Yep. And then she hooks up with this man that Quentin has brought in, Niccolo, right? I believe. And Niccolo flirts with him, and they do cocaine together. And
well, let's make clear: Quentin and Niccolo like coax Tanya into doing the cocaine. There was a lot of sort of like, it's a party, don't you want to have fun sort of things that are happening. Like Quentin very quickly whisks her around the room, then introduces her to Niccolo, holds back her hair while she does cocaine, seemingly is like encouraging her during this evening to be as potentially hedonistic and maybe reckless as possible.
We do get some full male frontal nudity in this episode, and I think I think it's worth mentioning just because if you're going to show nudity in general, I feel like you should be equal opportunity nudists for both genders, and it's rare to see like full frontal male nudity in TV shows in general. So
did we get it with Cam? Well, like we don't know if it was Theo James, but we do see.
I don't think we ever saw his thing in this show.
We did. I thought we did in the first episode.
I think we saw his ass and maybe the side of it, you know. But his back was to the mirror, if I recall correctly. So
interesting. Okay.
But maybe you just imagine Theo James' penis, and that's completely fine.
That's possible. You know? But yes, and this it's a reveal, right?
Yeah.
But the more important reveal,
yes,
is the photo. Do you want to talk about the photo?
Okay. So at one point, she picks up this photo, and
they're in like Quentin's bedroom. It seems like she's looking at photos that are on a bedside table. And there is a black and white photo that Tanya hones in on. And it is two men wearing cowboy hats. And it is a younger Quentin and a younger Greg.
Now, I
have a lot of questions.
Well, first of all, it's a general problem that photoshopped photos in general in TV shows and films look awful. And I felt like this one was no different. It looked pretty fake and photoshopped to me, which is kind of a bummer because it's such a critical reveal in this episode. It looked pretty awful, and that's a bummer. I wish they had spent a little bit more time on it. But the other thing is that it's just, even if it wasn't done poorly, it's just like a pretty silly photo. Like, what did you think?
I just think the photo is sort of silly. I think that maybe a cowboy hat is not like Tom Hollander's look, potentially. But what was more confusing to me about this scene is that I feel like we've now had two important moments for Tanya where perhaps it's not entirely clear how she perceives them. Like in her conversation with Portia, I can totally understand why she doesn't come out and say like, "Hey, this is what I saw." She just sort of implies like Jack's bad news. Don't necessarily bank all of your hopes on this guy. But in this moment, like I'm not sure what Tanya's reaction is to
Like,
the
does she
photo.
realize like what is actually going on?
Right. She's
Basically.
done a lot of cocaine, like a lot of cocaine.
Hmm.
And I don't know if we get like I just think her expression is inscrutable
Hmm.
rather than like, oh hey, that's my husband. You know? I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
Or potentially, why isn't she like, holy shit, this whole thing has been set up to murder me. I need the
Right.
GTFO, right?
Right.
It's tough. It's tough when the audience is ahead of the characters, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the case here. Like we as the audience, we have like all these theories about what's going on, and we don't know if Tanya feels any of it at all. Probably not, based on our knowledge of things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough.
Yeah.
But yeah, but then she does have sex with this guy. So
Yeah. Or seemingly does. He's naked. He's like kneeling in
yeah,
front of her.
yeah.
And we then sort of leave that room. But again, it's very funny to me that she's just like, okay, yeah, let's do this in this
Again,
bedroom. Where I
again,
found.
she's had a lot of cocaine. She's
Yeah.
probably just high on life. So
Yeah.
um,
So I guess again, this is something that will probably be resolved next episode. Like, how much did she absorb
yeah,
the
yeah.
photo?
Uh, we also had a whole plotline with Portia and Jack.
Right.
Again, Portia has a conversation with Tanya that morning, uh, and Tanya tries to warn her off of the Jack situation, but she does tell Tanya does tell Portia, hey, maybe you should slow it down with this guy. Like, if
Right.
he's not willing to pay for an arancini, like maybe he's trouble,
Mm-hmm.
because an arancini is like $1. So
And I like the story that she tells about like feeling like she was conditioned from a young age to be a plaything for other people. That's
hmm
like a surprising amount of self-awareness from Tanya in that moment. And like you said, Jennifer Coolidge is like a little bit muted. And
yeah.
I liked that like a little bit more of a somber quality. But then again, it sort of speaks then later on to how that conditioning has endured because again, she puts on a frilly dress, she twirls around for Quentin, and then she goes out to this party where she's quote unquote the maid of honor, right? But really, she's just a diversion for these people.
Or a
So
mark,
yeah,
yeah.
so I really liked Coolidge's performance in that moment. But yeah, of course, she tells Portia to stay away from Jack, and Portia does the exact opposite.
I, you know, I think there's a reading of this season where um, Portia should have gotten together with Albie,
Hmm.
and uh, and she didn't, and pays dearly for it, as we see in this episode.
But what's interesting to me about that is I think we so far are supposed to feel, I think we're supposed to, mm, I might be projecting too much here, but I think in this episode in particular, we're supposed to think Portia made a mistake.
Yes.
Portia hooked up with this guy who is bad news. She's made a mistake or whatever. And we don't yet know if Albie has made the same mistake with Lucia because we
Hmm.
don't know if Lucia is running a con or not.
Yeah.
But in this episode in particular, I was like, oh, okay, so we're really supposed to like look at Portia and think you screwed up,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think they both screwed up. Like, they should have
Hmm.
ended up together, and instead they're with these other people who are using sex for transactive purposes, which is, I think, one
Hmm.
of the themes of the season, right?
Okay,
Um,
but can I go back and say, even if Albie and Portia had hooked up, wouldn't they also each be using sex for transactive purposes?
I
I
think they
only say,
genuinely. I think we're meant to think that they actually genuinely could like each other, even though, as we discussed, there's no like electricity there
well, the only
necessarily.
reason I
But
say
yeah.
that is because remember when Portia on the phone with her
Hmm.
sister was like, just find a guy, any guy to help pass the time. And
Hmm.
that's what sort of connects Portia with Albie in the first place.
Mm.
So I just mean more so, I don't necessarily mean in this context transactional in a bad way. I mean more that like
Sure. Yeah.
if Albie and Portia had just gone into it as like we're on vacation, we're only here for a week, let's have a good time. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I think that would have been fine, but it's not what happened. And so now Portia's spending the day with Jack, which,
Well, what's interesting too is Jack is actively trying to keep her away from the party.
yes.
And so this does lend credence to the Latanya's theory, who emailed into us, and many other people's theory that like Jack is there to keep Portia distracted.
Jack is bad news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He gets super drunk and very embarrassing, and Portia is very put upon. And then they eventually have like a conversation. You know, he's like getting belligerent with people on the street, like he's
Mm-hmm.
actively like endangering her.
Mm-hmm.
They get back to the hotel, and then uh he's very drunk and kind of accidentally lets slip that like Quentin's probably not really his uncle.
Yeah,
Um
I think he's drunk enough where
yeah.
whatever like gently leading questions
Hmm.
Portia is asking him, he's drunk enough to share. So he sort of talks about how he was in like a very deep hole at
Yeah.
one point in his life, which goes back to earlier in the episode where he sort of is like shaming Portia a little bit, right?
Hmm.
For like complaining about the world. I think he is doing a little bit of like, what do you have to complain about?
Yeah.
You're
I've hit
here with
rock bottom, you know, like
right. I've hit rock
everything's
bottom.
icing on the cake for me.
Right. You're here with your wealthy boss. You don't have to work. You're just
Yeah.
spending time on a free trip. And yes, he sort of calls Quentin more of a friend, right,
Hmm.
than a family
Yeah.
member. Confirms that he's broke and he was going to have to sell the villa, but now he's coming into some
He's
money.
coming into some money.
Right.
Wonder
Right.
what that's all
Wonder what
about.
that is.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Uh, and then he kind of falls asleep, and Portia is like, "I've made a huge tiny mistake."
Yes.
Yeah,
I've made a terrible, terrible
yeah,
error.
yeah. Anything
Yeah.
else about this plotline before we move to the final
Um,
discussion?
no, I think that's it. I just again, I sort of am curious about exactly the nature of Greg and Quentin's relationship. Like if it's actually a romantic relationship or if Greg just knew Quentin was in Italy and it's a way to come into some money. I'm curious how that plays out.
My feeling. Okay, I mean, I'm gonna ask you to make predictions at the end of this podcast
Sure.
episode. Okay, so okay, we'll save it for that. But like,
Mhm.
so I'll share my theories as well. But like,
Mhm.
anyway, let's get to the final plotline. Valentina and Mia and Isabella, right?
Mhm.
Salvatore from the beach club is relentlessly hitting on Isabella in the lobby. Valentina separates them. Did you, and she, Isabella later describes it as like that's what's going on. I don't think we like
Yeah.
get it from that scene, but yeah.
Yeah.
It's Valentina's birthday. She asks Isabella for a drink after work so they can have a toast together. That evening, Valentina puts on lip gloss, getting ready to leave with Isabella. Isabella comes up to her, asks that Salvatore be moved.
Mhm.
It's making her uncomfortable. And then
Mhm.
she says she wants Rocco back at the front desk because Rocco is her boyfriend and they are engaged.
Right. Was her boyfriend, now is her fiance, and they were just like keeping it on the down low at work.
Hmm.
Right. Which Valentina is of course not happy about.
She's stunned, I think,
Yeah.
and she's trying to like hide her stun because she Valentina is interested in Isabella romantically, right?
Right.
And so it's painful for Valentina. She goes to get a drink at the bar and then ends up hooking up with Mia
Right.
because that was kind of the terms of their arrangement.
See,
Um,
I really felt like this existed outside of the arrangement. I thought that this was like Mia hitting on Valentina. Like, I agree with you. They had discussed the arrangement previously. Mia had said, like, I know you're a lesbian. Like, let me play the piano, whatever, whatever. But this scene was just so. It felt like we were. I don't know how we were supposed to feel. I don't know if we were supposed to think that Mia is actually genuinely interested in Valentina and this was an expression of that, or to your point, if she's just following through on their perceived bargain. Again, I don't love the Mia characterization
yeah,
here, so I didn't quite
I,
know what to
I
make
have
of it.
given up on hoping for any kind of depth to the Mia character.
Yeah, poor
Um,
Mia. Sorry,
but
Mia.
yeah, but I think I did find that this episode gave Valentina some depth and
Mhm.
a tragic nature, tragic nature to that character of I think she's feels like she is gay and she's
Mhm.
never been with a woman and she's very repressed. Um and that explains a lot of her behavior throughout the season.
Also
So,
still very bad at her job.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be hitting on employees and so on.
No.
But
No.
I did kind of enjoy how Isabella is like completely oblivious to everything. I was like, is this believable? And I was like, no, I think it's believable.
I think it's
You know?
believable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is believable. Like I
Yeah.
think like Valentina, I think potentially something that I think the scene does very interestingly is like, should Valentina have told Isabella that she's interested in her romantically? And I know there very much is the argument of like, someone should not have to come out all the time, right? Like, you shouldn't have to explain who you are all the time. So I appreciated that. But then I also felt like potentially Valentina, as we then later learn, is a person who hasn't had a lot of opportunities to do this, to date, maybe hasn't been comfortable dating. So clearly asking out Isabella took a lot out of her, right? Like it felt like a big, like courageous moment. And then, to have that deflated so fully was not
Yeah.
great for her.
It's really
Yeah.
sad. This is probably the best sort of Valentina episode since the beginning of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't excuse her behavior, but
Mm-hmm.
it does make her kind of more tragic. And I like that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
um, okay. That's it. That's most of the plot lines of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the penultimate episode of White Lotus season 2. It's time to make our predictions, Roxana. It's time to
Okay.
make some calls about what's actually going on. And next week, I should point out, by the way, also that um, next week we're going to be recording live right after the episode airs. So
Mm-hmm.
typically we have like lots of prep. Roxana prepares like immaculate show notes, and we kind of talk
Aside from
through.
Daphne's child's photo, pretty solid show notes.
They're
Yeah.
really good show notes, and then we kind of talk about, we walk through it in the way that we do in the podcast. But we're not going to get the finale next week,
Mhm.
and so next week is going to be pretty. It'll be a little bit more rough than it
Mhm.
usually is, and it
Mhm.
might not be as methodical as
Mhm.
usual. But I am going to ask you to make some calls, Roxana, on like what is going on. So let's ask the big questions, okay?
Yeah.
Uh, Here's some very basic questions. We'll
Okay.
just do like 3, 4, or 5 questions. Here we go.
Okay.
What is the nature of Jack and Quentin's relationship? So my thinking is basically Quentin got Jack out of some terrible addiction or
Mhm.
debt hole a long time
Right.
ago,
Right.
and is therefore like kind of has a lifetime debt to Quentin. Jack has a lifetime debt to Quentin, which he is fulfilling by being Portia's fuck boy
Yeah,
for
I
this
mean,
episode. Right?
again, I think probably uh hmm. I think it is probably the show's real like pimp slash sex worker relationship. Like I think
Mm.
that there is essentially a debt that
Yeah.
Jack has to pay. And so he's part of Quentin's crew to sort of pay that off.
Mhm.
Because if we take what Jack says is true, this is something they do, right? They sort
Yeah.
of like they travel around, they
Yeah.
befriend older women, and so I think Jack plays the role of the distraction or the diversion over and over again. Yeah, so I think there was like an addiction situation or some other type of rock bottom thing, as you alluded to earlier. So yeah,
It
I'm thinking not related unless Mike White really wanted to add another level of like messed upness to this
Mhm.
storyline.
Mhm.
But
Is
yeah.
whether or not he accomplishes it,
Hmm.
is Quentin's intention to murder Tanya?
I think yes.
I think yes.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think this episode had enough like ominous touches.
Yeah.
We didn't discuss it, but there's a shot where like Tanya is dancing on the dance floor,
Mhm.
and then we sort of pause on her. We see that she has made eye contact with Quentin. The music drops out, and they just share like sort of an ominous kind of look, and then the music comes back in. So unless we get like a hard diversion at this point, I think Quentin is nefarious, very nefarious.
Yeah. Is Albie Lucia's mark in some way, or does Lucia actually like Albie? I
Can we
think I
say it's
think
both?
yeah, maybe it's like, when I got into this, it was just because it was my job, but then I fell in love, it's possible. I think he's just a mark. I don't think she has any feelings to him. So,
I think
that's what I'm gonna put
she
it.
I think she does. I think when she says stuff like I wish all men were like you, I think that's genuine,
Mm-hmm.
but
I
yeah.
think it's all just part of the game. That's my
Okay.
prediction. So
Okay.
was was Harper actually cheating on Ethan with
Oh my
Cam?
God.
With
Oh
Cam,
man.
I know. Yeah, we're gonna have to make a tough call here. Tough call. This one's the most ambiguous, I think.
I don't know if we'll ever know, but I think it would make more sense for the character if she was not.
I'll say yes. I think she was doing
Okay.
something. Oh, but yeah.
Here's what I'll
Yeah,
say.
because
I
here's the
think
thing:
if she,
they show it to you, like they show you the fantasy scene in this episode. So it's
yeah,
like
I
it.
think if she was, it's because the story needed her to.
Mhm,
I don't
mhm.
think the character as written would do that.
The reason I think so, they show you the Ethan fantasy scene, and
Yeah.
it's like when a TV show or film does that. Typically, when they show you something like that, not always, maybe even 50% of the time, 50-50,
Mm-hmm.
let's say,
Mm-hmm.
what they show you as the fantasy didn't happen
Right.
because
It's just to sort of lead you along
it's just to lead
in
you along. But then,
thinking.
like when you find out the truth,
Right.
it's usually not like, oh, so the thing we saw as a fantasy happened. Like that. That's not very satisfying, right?
Yeah. I
What's more
agree.
satisfying, like a great example of this would be Mission Impossible
Mm-hmm.
6
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fallout. There's a
Mm-hmm.
scene where like Tom Cruise is like imagining what happens if he goes along on this heist.
Yeah, he's
And
imagining the attack on the French police.
yes, that's right. That's right. And then it's like, then the attack on the French police actually happens and it plays out way differently than
Yeah.
how he imagined it. And it's because if they just showed it again in the same way, it would be extremely unsatisfying
Right.
and repetitive, right?
Right.
So it's like, if they show it to you, like the fact that they had the fantasy scene makes me feel like you're right,
Mm-hmm.
Roxana, that she's not actually cheating with him.
What if we had a scene where we learned that Harper came on to Cam and Cam said no, or that Cam came on to Harper and she said no?
Mm.
I don't know. I'm just trying to think of
Yeah,
like,
that's possible. That's
yeah,
possible.
what else could complicate that?
All right, so I think we're both on the no side of
Hopefully no.
yeah, hopefully no. Okay.
Hopefully no.
Uh, uh we're coming up with the final one or two questions here, but like
Okay.
the basic the ultimate question is, and these are related.
Yeah.
Does Quentin succeed in killing Tanya, and who are the dead bodies at the beginning of the show?
Okay.
My guess is that Quentin's plan, as we've discussed, is to kill Tanya.
Right.
That Quentin and his crew of people fail spectacularly
Okay.
for some reason.
Okay.
My guess is because of Portia's intervention, because she's the only person that could help at this point.
Okay.
And they all end up dying instead.
Like Quentin, Jack, and
Quentin, Jack, and
potentially
all the
Greg.
people.
Quentin, Jack, and
Yeah,
Greg, maybe.
Quentin, Jack, and Greg. That's right. They all end up
Okay.
dying.
Okay.
Because it feels like the show wouldn't kill Jennifer Coolidge, but that's just my gut feeling. So I think they fail in killing Jennifer Coolidge, and they're the ones who end up dying. That's my guess.
Okay.
All right. Do you have any guesses?
In the beginning of the season, I thought that Coolidge was going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no real reason for thinking this. But I wonder if it's Albie, Dom, and Bert. The
And
only
why?
reason I
Why
say
is
those
that?
things is
You think
because
So you think Quentin doesn't succeed, and the actual dead bodies are the Degrassos?
yes. The only reason I think this is because I feel like Bert's storyline this episode is kind of tragic.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's like a little bit of it feels like a story ending potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like Albie and Dom, there's been so much of a discussion about like people who leave versus people who stay, the family that they left behind to come here,
Mm-hmm.
potentially Albie being an easy mark for Lucia. I feel like if they all die, that sort of closes the Lucia narrative whole and maybe provides it with some resolution.
Mm.
But I really do not know. It's interesting because I think in season 1, looking back on it, once you know who dies in season 1, there's a lot of setup for it, I think. Because you see that character like spinning out of control a little bit.
Yes.
With this, the setup is definitely for Tanya. I would be very surprised if the Quentin and Greg crew can pull it off, I guess.
Yeah.
And
All
what
right.
would that look like? Like, would they really drown her? Like, would they come back from the villa to the hotel to drown her? That doesn't make sense to me either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know.
Well, those are our predictions. I think that's a very strong set of predictions we just made. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like between the two of us, we're probably right about most of the things, but who knows? Time makes fools of us all. If
Yeah.
you have a prediction, send it to us at decodingtv@gmail.com. If somebody
Yes.
hits it dead on, I'm going to
Yes.
definitely read it on the air.
Oh, yeah.
So feel free to predict like who you think's going to die. Does Tanya die? Is Lucia Albie's mark, or vice versa, and so on. Let us know at decodingtv@gmail.com. But that's going to bring us into this week's episode of Decoding TV. Roxana, where can people find more of your work on the internet?
You can find me at Vulture, and you can find me on Twitter still.
And you can find Decoding TV on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, I should say, at Decoding TV. Email us at decodingtv@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We'll be back next week and figure out what happens in the season 2 finale of The White Lotus. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.